So now is kind of when we really get into the meat and potatoes of how we actually put fire on the ground, right? So when we're talking about putting fire on the ground, these are what we call our prescribed fire techniques. So within this unit here, we're going to talk about the different types of fire. We're going to talk a little bit about the ignition patterns that we use. We're going to talk about what kind of enhancements. There's some enhancements that we can use to increase our fire behavior, and then we're also going to talk about how to properly do like patrolling and holding, and then kind of end it with our mop up. So in order to understand how we're doing our ring fire technique that we typically use, you have to understand the basic types of fire. All right. So there's three parts of the fire. There's the backing fire, flanking fire, and the head fire. And we'll go through each one. So a backing fire is how we start every single prescribed burn that we ever do, right? So the very first thing that we do is we light a backing fire off an anchor point or our fire break. It could be a mowed line, wet line, or it could be a disc fire break, rototill fire break, whatever it may be. But this is the fire that basically backs into the wind. This is going to be typically our lowest intensity part of the fire. It's also going to give us the longest residence time. So that means it burns really slow because it's basically backing into the wind. With residence time, that could be a good thing, right? If we would need longer residence time, we'd want to use backing fire. It also has lower flame lengths. So, if we're trying to kill a cedar tree, that's 4 or 5 foot tall, having a backing fire go up against it is probably not the best because you might not have long enough flame lengths to actually get to it. So like I said, this is how we start every prescribed burn. Here you can see in this kind of demonstration, you got the anchor point and here's the fire break and they're basically lighting right off of it and it's backing into this direction. So it's basically backing into the wind. So next I've got a video that will show several different examples of it backing. There's also some examples of it backing up a hill. So if you go back and we refer back to when we were talking about fire behavior, about slopes and how typically our weather or wind overcomes our slopes, you'll see this fire backing up a hill really nicely. And then at the end of the video, there's actually also a video that shows a backing fire versus a head fire, which we'll talk about next. So as you can see, slowly backing into, we can see the smoke is fairly light. You got long residence time, lower flame lengths. You could probably jump over the top of that. No problem. You can see now, you could tell if we tried to back burn an entire property, it would take forever. Look how slow that's going. I mean, this is like, 10 seconds, but it would take absolutely forever for us to burn the whole property. Here's a backing fire. They're putting in a wet line right next to it. It's not a great wet line, but, and then here's that video of it backing up a hill. So you can see the smoke's coming from left to right. It's slowly, but it's torching these cedar trees though. So they're small. And then you got the backing fire on the right, and then you got an example of a head fire coming right up against it, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But you see the difference in how fast it is, how big the flames are. And there's implications for all of this stuff when we're actually burning. So the big thing about the backing fire too is, when we're doing our ring fire technique, we're putting as much downwind black as we possibly can. So the next part of our fire is going to be our flanking fire. So these can be on the sides. And this is typically why we have two crews. We got, each crew has at least one flank of the fire as we go down it. And this fire is going to be what we call parallel to the wind. And then this is basically kind of a medium intensity. We have medium flame lengths, medium residence time. The really cool thing that I like about flanking fires, and we can utilize this when we're doing our ignitions, is that the flame doesn't has less influence with the wind than all the others. Like backing, so if a backing fire, imagine that that flame length is going to be bent over, and then a head fire is going to be bent the other way. With a flank fire, that flame tends to stand straight up and down. So you can see how good it would be to use in a scenario where we're trying to get fire up into the canopy of a cedar tree, scattered cedar trees on the landscape. You could actually use flanking fire and that straight up and down flame to better kill that tree. So the next video is going to be just several examples of what flanking fire looks like. Again, it's not moving, it doesn't move as fast. Medium flame lengths, you can see some of the darker smoke there. That means we're getting less combustion, less complete combustion. You see how the smoke rises a little bit differently. You can see here how these two flank fires, they're basically, looks like they're just standing still there, not moving. And then there's an example of a wetline, which we'll talk about later. So the final component of our fire is going to be a head fire. And this is like the big flashy one. It's lit with the wind, so the fire is basically heading in the direction of that the wind is going to. And these are typically really high intensity flames. They have very low residence time, so they just basically blow past the vegetation, and then they also have higher flame lengths. And you'll see in this video a couple how high those flame lengths can get. So that's almost the exact place where that flank fire was. Now it turned into a head fire. You can see the flames ever increasing. Typically blacker smoke because of less complete combustion. And here you can kind of see you got the head fire here, but if you look along this edge here too, that's a flanking fire. So you can see the difference between that and the head fire, how fast that head fire is moving. All right, so now that we have the three main types of fire down, we're going to talk about how we actually ignition pattern, and the ignition pattern that we typically use in our grasslands, known as the ring fire ignition. So this is the most common method, and this is basically how we do almost every single burn that we do. So what happens is that both teams will start down a downwind point, and basically they'll do a ring around the perimeter. So teams go like team A and team B, they hit in opposite directions. The first thing they'll do is, we do our backing fire, right? So we'll put in a nice backing fire, and then we'll come in and we'll actually get more and more black downwind. And as we get more and more black downwind, our two crews on our flanks will continue to kind of go around that ring. And then once we get enough black downwind, then we're able to finish our circle or our ring and start the head fire. And then all those embers from that head fire will drop into what we've already burned through our back burning. And then any embers that land in this zone that are hot won't start anything on fire. And then anything that is or isn't hot and is cold lands outside of here. That's our main goal. Now, if we don't get it right and we start our head fire before we get enough downwind black, we could potentially throw embers outside of our burn unit and actually start a spot fire outside that burn unit. And that's probably the most difficult thing to tell people. There's no like good rule of thumb of like, you need to have at least 200 yards before you do this. All that is based on fuel conditions, fire weather, stability of the atmosphere. There's just what kind of fuel is downwind? Is it ungrazed rangeland, or is it CRP, or is it trees, or what it may be? All makes a big difference. But the big thing is that the ring fire technique is you're putting in a downwind black, going around the flanks, and you're basically creating a ring fire. So this next video will basically show you that one of the reasons why we use the ring fire technique is because we have what happens is the fire collapses in on itself. It's like creates its own little low pressure system basically, and it collapses in on itself and basically gets the smoke up into the atmosphere. And then those embers get up into the atmosphere and they cool down before they actually hit the ground. And that's like the main purpose. There you go. So you can see he started in this downwind corner down here. Here's our flanks. He put the head fire right here. You can see that there's fire coming from this direction, this direction, this direction, and it's all coming in on itself. And now you'll watch as it collapses in on itself. And there as it collapsed on itself, and you can see that big kind of plume of smoke go up. So a couple things to think about when we're doing our ring fire technique is one, you want to make sure the teams are kind of making similar progress. You don't want to like have a wind shift and trap one team if the wind changes. Um, One team usually has to eat more smoke than the other, and we'll have a tougher time of it. If you can try to break this up, it's always good, but um, it could be an issue sometimes. And communication between the crews and the burn boss is pretty critical. So now we're going to talk about interior ignition. So when we're doing our ring fire technique, like I said, the first thing that we're going to do is put our back burn in. And we want to get enough downwind black in before we light the head fire so our embers have a place to fall. So what if we started our back burn and we just let the whole thing back burn until we got to the point where we could light the flank and the head fire? If we did that, I'll tell you, we've tried, plenty of vacuum fires, but what happens is it just take too long. By the time we got enough downwind black, we would be running out of time. It'd be getting dark or late in the afternoon when the humidity is really, really low. So we actually use what we call interior ignition. And so we use interior ignition to speed up putting in that black line to basically build to layer upon layer of black to build that line in. And there's three different ways that you can do it. They're all fairly similar processes. So we'll actually use this sometimes if the fuel is really light or even too green, isn't burning well, we could use it. Or like I said, our main objective is to help widen black lines. We can also use this to burn out around objects that we need to. So in this photo here, you can kind of see they've got the downwind black right here, but then you got a guy here and a guy here. They're actually doing what we call strip head firing, which we'll talk about next, to put more black downwind. So the first technique is strip head firing. Basically, this is igniting in parallel strips beginning on the downwind side. Big thing about this is that you always start small, like really small. So the first thing you'll do is you'll put in your initial backing fire right off of your wet line. And you want to let that back off that wet line for a couple feet before you go in and start another strip. So in this example, you can see where they started the fire, as is right here in this corner, and it's slowly backing into the unit. So they're going to let this back off the unit, and then once they get it back off enough, they're going to take another strip right next to it to increase to basically double the amount of black downwind. Now, what's really important here is that obviously this is just a broad general example of how to do it. When you're putting in the first line, the second strip, the third and fourth strip, you're taking really small chunks. If you take too big of a chunk, that flame link is going to be bigger than your wet line is, and you're going to cause a slop over or spot fire to happen. So, and I'm talking like like when you first put the first one in, it's a game of inches to put that second line in. And as you build more black, you can take bigger and bigger strips, and those strips are generally dictated by the crew boss and the burn boss about how far they want somebody to go into the unit and take those strips. And obviously, as you get further and further in, so if you got 100 yards of black, you can take a pretty big chunk. But if you only got 6 inches of black, you can't take a 10-yard strip, otherwise it's going to go over your line. So here's a video. Watch the initial line here. That flame length that Bitey's taken, those flames are almost reaching over that wet line. But you can see they continue to keep building black in here. And you can see the patrol on the outside there too. I'll play it again for you. But it's just this constant process of layering the black on the fire, making it bigger and larger. So when we do light the head fire, there's plenty of room to bounce back. But when we replay this thing again, take a look at outside the unit there. You'll see that those UTVs and ATVs are right there where they're lighting to make sure that nothing jumps the line. See ATV guy right there, right where he's lighting. Perfect. Secondary guy right there. See, now that they got further off the line, those UTVs and ATVs can kind of, relax a little more. It's always that first 10, 15, 20 yards of that back burn that we put on is the most dangerous time typically during a burn for risk of escape. So when we're doing our strip head fire technique, one thing I don't know if I mentioned, but when we're putting in that downwind black, that initial line right off of the wet line, make sure that you have a good continuous stream of drip torch fuel coming out because we want a solid black line. But as we get further into the burn unit, we'll actually turn down our drip torches and actually just do point ignitions. So instead of laying down a continuous strip, we'll have it just kind of dripping out and we'll just drop spots as we go along within our burn unit. And then they burn together and it's fine. This is basically just going to save us a bunch of fuel as we go through the day. So flank fire strips, we don't use this a ton, but it could be definitely used. In this scenario, you're basically, you're parallel to the wind. So basically you get your downwind black in. In this scenario, they probably should add another people on the fire line here. So you have 4 or 5 people. And basically you just walk it straight back into the wind. This is a really good technique, like I said, if you're trying to kill cedar trees in a pasture to get that up and down flame length. But it would also be a really good technique to get smoke up into the air because that flank fire really helps kind of get that smoke up. So if you're burning near houses or something like that or town, try to get that smoke up in the air better than a back burn would. All right, so it's hard doing interaction on this, but if you were going to start this burn, where would you choose to be? Or start it at? Remember, downwind anchor point. So we're looking at a northwest wind, right? So where would you start it? Would you start at F, E, D, or A, B, C? Obviously, if you started anywhere at A, B, or C, that northwest wind, you're basically starting to head fire and it's gone. You're gonna have a problem on your hand. Now, northwest wind, you could potentially start it at F, E, or D, but what's the most optimal place to start this burn? Let's think about that. You know, if you had two different crews and you're doing ring fire technique, most people would probably choose E. But here's the problem with that. So we got a northwest wind or north wind. What happens if our wind just slightly shifts more to the northwest and we start at E? Well, that fire could take off on us and beat us to D. So we always want to find a good anchor point, which would be D. So if that wind did shift to the northwest just a tiny bit or to the northeast, we've got it kind of cornered in this corner down here, and it's not going to run on us on either direction. So choosing your downwind starting point is always pretty important. All right. So sometimes we want to kill big cedar trees or bigger cedar trees, and the fine fuels that we have out there just aren't hot enough or big enough to get up into the trees due to some of the shading of the trees. So we'll actually use this process called what's called cutting and stuffing. And basically, we're using this to increase our fire intensity and mortality in dense stands of cedar trees. So really, it's the difference between killing 30% of a stand or 100%. And 100% is better, obviously. So this can be done on both really the upwind or downwind side. You can place them at the bottom of the canyons, take advantage of terrain. The big thing also though is when you burn big groups of cedar trees like this, our fire behavior and intensity is going to escalate significantly. So you always want to make sure you have enough downwind black that is supportive of this technique. So think about like, a group of cedar trees, they could have a spot fire a quarter mile away, maybe a half mile at times. So you'd have to have either that much distance on your downwind side, or you'd have to have those spotters or lookouts potentially in those areas. Now, without cutting and stuffing this area, it'd be pretty hard to get some of these cedar trees to go. So a lot of times we can burn right up to cedar trees and we can't even get them to go. So I think this is a video of the cutting and stuffing in action, and you'll see how intense the flames can be. But it's very visually satisfying, but it's also like personal satisfaction of all these dead trees. So you can see that it burns really fast and really hot, and then the skeletons are the only thing left standing, and all those trees are going to be dead. And in this is you'll notice that in a couple years, grass fills right back in underneath all these trees. All right, so this is big. So this is probably besides UTV, ATV patrols, utilizing and knowing how to lay down wetline is super important. So typically, like I said, we're using mode fire breaks, and so mode fire breaks in their own are not going to stop fires. So we have to use some other, and that's water. So it's basically a temporary control line. So our water can dry out, right? So we have to worry about that. But we're basically laying down a wet line, and you can see right in this picture here. See, there's the tire tracks from the truck. And this gentleman right here is laying down water pretty close to the ground. He's got good distance, good width on it, and he's got good amount of gallons per minute coming out. And then the gentleman right next to him has that drip torch, and he's got that wand like right on the ground, right next to that wet line. And so what they'll do is the wind is coming from the right to the left here. What they'll do is they'll lay down that wet line and then allow this to kind of burn off that line. And then they'll come in and take a few strips and kind of build that black with our strip head fire ignition. So the amount of water, the width of water, the pressure of water is all determined by local conditions. So, there's no like specific guidance I can give, like, it needs to be 6 inches wide. It kind of all depends on the fuel. So, and that's part of the purpose of the test fire is to determine those things. Same thing with like heat. So if it's 90 degrees outside, that water is not going to last as long as if it was 60 degrees on there. So here's a video showing some wet lining. You can see it's kind of a slow process, right? It's just laying down that wet line and then letting that fire just gently back off of it. Now here's an improper way. One, they're right up against this really tall grass, and look how thin that water line is. You can imagine what's going to happen here. That flame length and these tall fuels are basically going to flop over and start a spot fire or a slop over. And you'll see it happen like right here, I think it is. Oh, there it is. So now if we don't have an ATV or UTV patrolling, yeah, there it goes. If we don't have ATV or UTV patrolling, that's a slop over right there, and we're going to have a problem. So laying down that wet line is super critical, and getting it right is pretty easy, but having the right equipment is critical. Just a few things here, like negotiating hills. Obviously, fire moves uphill. So a lot of times, if you're going to light in a drainage, you'll want to start at the top of the hill and go meet down the bottom. A lot of times, we can't get trucks down in there, so maybe we'll drag that hose out and go all the way down to the meeting point. Same thing with curves. The big thing with these curves is take them out. Take them out of your burn plan. They shouldn't be in there. You can burn them later. But if you're going to burn them, just the main point of this is you got to coordinate these curves with both of the teams. And so what that means to me is that this is just more time taken out of my burn day to mess with, 5 acre little patch or something like that. It just causes more problems than they're worth. So many times we would just, in the burn plan, I would probably either just cut it off right here, put a mode fire break in here, and burn it separately, or not burn it at all. Same thing here about just coordinating, making sure that you're meeting up, the same place so you're not pushing fire onto anybody. So beyond putting in the downwind black on the wet lining, the second most important part is actually what we call holding and patrol. Holding is really simple. So let's say you're doing a ring fire technique, and one team needs to stop while another team catches up. Well, holding is basically just sitting there, making sure the fire doesn't go anywhere until that team is ready for you to continue to move. So you basically sit there with a flapper or pumper and just put it out so it doesn't spread any further. A lot of times we'll just kind of creep like foot by foot, just real slow as we go along to hold that. But patrol is the most important part. So patrolling is basically going back and forth on the line, the fire break, to look for any slop overs or suppress any spot fires or extinguish any kind of hot spots along the way. So we're typically using ATVs, engines, flappers, rakes, whatever it takes to do this. So everyone on the fire should be actively looking for, on the lookout for any spotting and slop overs or anything like that. But then the main people, the first ATV, the lead igniter, lead ATV is going to be staying pretty close to the engine because that's typically where the problems happen. So they stick pretty close. And that second ATV is the one that kind of keeps going back and forth checking for materials. Now, patrol it's super important, but it can also just be kind of tedious, right? All you're doing is driving up and down the line, spraying water on any kind of smoldering stuff, making sure nothing's popping over the line or anything. So here's a video of kind of patrolling the line. Again, having a good pumper in the back of a truck, they're just looking at the smoldering line. By this time, our wet line may have dried out, so they're catching any kind of flames happening along there, and they're doing this all day long. Sometimes it's in smoke, which is bad, but. And then this next part, so here's the pumper up here. Pause it real quick. So here's the pumper up here. Here's the lead ATV, and they're patrolling that fire line. Looks like there's another person on foot that's following it. Looks like this is maybe a flank fire or head fire, but. And then here's the second ATV that's following up right behind it. So this first person on the ATV is checking the line, making sure it's good. And then the second person is driving back and forth all the way back to the beginning of the unit, making sure everything's good too. So once a fire is basically all complete, one of the biggest things is mopping up. So mopping up is basically that, right? Extinguishing any burning material on the fire line. If you're in treed areas, you're cutting down trees, felling snags. Basically, you don't want to declare a burnout for at least 24 hours. If you're burning oak woodlands like this picture here, it may be several 2-3 days before things stop smoking that you need to stop worrying about it. I don't think I got a picture on here, but within Mopup, you could use a harrow on the back of an ATV to drag along the fire line. It's kind of really nice. It breaks up some of the cow pies and plants and stuff along the edge. But when you're doing Mopup, typically you want to kind of think about in spatial distances, like okay, what's within 100 foot of the line, what's 200 foot, what's 300 foot, like what do I have to be worried about? Honestly, it's like typically in a grassland situation, you're looking at the first like 10 to 20 feet of really good mop up. Like between that distance, or 0 to 20 foot, I guess. Um, so those are the distances in which you really want to pay attention to. Now, as you get further in the unit, you have less to be concerned about. But like, if you get into the unit and you got a big cottonwood tree that's, 100 foot tall and it's on fire, that's something that needs to be obviously looked at and remedied.